Well, good morning. Can you hear me okay? I'm not speaking, that's why you can't hear me. But I'm assuming, is this live? I want to know that the sound's working all right, is it?
Yes.
Thank you very much. It's important. Listen, this is great for you. What time is it there? 3:15 in the afternoon. It's 7 o'clock in the morning here in Los Angeles. And I've been up, you need to know this, I have been up since 5:30 for you. I don't do this for members of my own family. So, but I wanted, obviously, to be part of today because, as you just heard, I was the founding chairman of Artswork. I mean, there have been other better chairmen since, but I was asked when this started in think about this, in 1987 is when we started Artswork. And at the time, I was 37, let's face it. And Margaret Thatcher was Queen at the time. We had not had the 1988 Education Act. There was no national curriculum at that point. There was no internet, no cell phones, no smartphones, no food, no electricity, no people. No, but at the time, I was directing a national project called the Arts and Schools Project, and it was intended to promote the importance of the arts in the school system. It came out of a report that I and others had written with support from the Gulbenkian Foundation called the Arts and Schools. That came out in 1982. But the work we were quoting then went way back before 1982. Now, the reason I'm saying it is that the fact this is a 30th anniversary is really important for all kinds of reasons. One of them is that the things that you're talking about today and all the groups in the room are involved in have very much a contemporary turn because of what's going on in the world right now. But if you're feeling frustrated, if you're feeling that people beyond the community don't quite understand it, this isn't a new feeling. For a very long time, people have been campaigning to try and get the arts further up the social agenda, further up the agenda for education, and I should say too, to try and forge a closer relationship between education and cultural organisations. When we did the Arts and Schools report in 1982, one of the arguments we were making there was that arts organisations should have more developed approaches to education. The Arts Council, I know you heard from Darren earlier, the Arts Council at the time, which was in the old building in Piccadilly, it was called the Arts Council of Great Britain then, and it was at 105 Piccadilly, which used formerly to be the Hotel Splendide, I gather, which I thought was great. By the way, I should say that I am not the only Kenneth Robinson out there. I mean, no, don't accept cheap alternatives, obviously. There are other Kenneth Robinsons, and one of them, just before we started Artswork, was the chairman of the Arts Council of Great Britain. He'd previously been the chairman of the National Coal Board. So this is relevant. If you go back to when I was working on the Arts and Schools report in the late 70s, it was funded by the Gulbenkian Foundation. So I went to the Arts Council of England of Great Britain to see if they had any education files. Because the Arts Council of Great Britain didn't do education at that point, not really. There wasn't an education department, there wasn't an education officer. So I went along to see if they had any education files that we could look at for the report we're writing called the Arts and Schools. Now, you have to bear in mind that I was not at the time the distinguished international figure that you see before you right now. I was channeling Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin in these days. I was leather bound, long haired, tremendously attractive, I have to say. But I headed over to the Arts Council, and there was a lady on the reception desk who was rather prim, as I recall. People were at the Arts Council. And I said, could I have a look at your education files? And she looked at me as if I'd said something unpleasant. And she said, well, I imagine that they would be in the library. I said, well, could I go to the library and have a look? And she said, very well. And she called them and she said, I have a person here in the reception desk who is looking for information on education. And she looked at me, she said, what is your name? And I said, it's Ken Robinson. And she said, it's Kenneth Robinson. So they assumed it was the chairman of the Arts Council. So I got in the lift and went up to the first floor and was greeted by the entire staff of the library. Put their coats on and straightened their ties and looked beyond me into the lift to see whose bag I was carrying. So I'm saying we have come a long way in 30 years. I was involved happily with the Birmingham Royal Ballet. I've been involved in all kinds of arts organisations over this whole period. And arts organisations now get, and I hope most of them get, that arts organisations don't need an arts policy and an education policy. It was a worry for me for a long time that education was seen as subordinate to the work of arts organisations, and the arts were seen as subordinate to the work of education organisations. So we were caught in a bit of a cleft stick here. I was arguing at the time, and I think not only me, but that arts organisations, whether they're music art organisations, galleries, or whoever, they don't need an arts policy and an education policy, which is often fractured from it. They need a cultural policy, which is a way of saying they need to have a set of artistic aspirations and purposes and a way of connecting the broader world around them with those purposes. And that's what we think of as an education policy, but it shouldn't be separate. It should be part of a single mission. And in the same way, education organisations, schools, certainly governments, for a very long time, have not fully recognised the extent to which the arts shouldn't be seen as some exotic addenda to education, but should be seen as fundamental to the very purposes for which education is conceived. So we were arguing this 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and Artswork came about in that context in the mid-1980s, before the national curriculum, and Margaret Thatcher was still Prime Minister. And the aim, it was set up by TVS, the TV station in the Southwest, with a pretty modest aim of creating a local festival for teenagers in the area. It was mainly teenagers, early teens that we're addressing then. And it's grown since then. And I was, I think, the founding chair for about 5 or 6 years. There have been people in the room who've been involved right the way through. Hilary Derman was the great stalwart of Artswork. Simon Ritchie took over as chairman, Rick Hall, John Dale, and Jane Bryant's doing wonderful work now with Artswork. And the thing is, it's gone on to be this great national agency through the commitment and vision and creativity of very many people over the past 30 years. So I know we're not here for nostalgia, but I just wanted to set this in the context that the origins and challenges that gave rise to Artswork have deep roots in issues within education, in the arts, in social policy. And the challenges are still there. That's the point. And they're going to be there for a good while longer yet. I dare say when we have the 60th anniversary, or whoever is there to have the 60th anniversary of Artswork in 2047, we'll be talking still about some of the challenges we face in getting the arts taken seriously. So I'm saying it for two reasons. One is that what you're doing is deeply important. It has been important. It continues to be important. And secondly, don't give up on it, because along the way, brilliant work has been done. Thousands and thousands of young people's lives have been affected, have been changed, not just through Artswork, but through all the agencies that Artswork connects with. And what you're doing isn't unique to Britain. It's certainly not unique to England. We're dealing with challenges here which are important and current across the whole planet. I live in America now, and we have just the same challenges here. I was at a conference in LA last week where we brought together arts agencies across the city. We face huge challenges here in this city. So that said, I just want to rehearse a couple of things about why this matters and where we go from here. What is the problem? It's worth reflecting on this, isn't it? Why do we have to keep telling people the arts matter? Why do we have to have conferences about it and keep cheering each other up, that we're doing the right thing? Mathematicians have conferences, but they don't normally kick off by patting themselves on the back about how important mathematics is and why don't people understand them. They get on, doing whatever it is they do. So we published a report, this isn't the royal plural, we published a report with the support of the Gulbenkian Foundation back in 1982 about the importance of the arts. Well, there are all kinds of ways of describing this, and I needn't spend a lot of time on it with you because you know this, but let me just summarize it. The problem we've faced for a long time is that the arts in the education system of many countries have been on the margins of education. And you have to ask, why is that? Why are the arts constantly being pushed aside? There was, in fact, a report published for the Council of Europe a number of years ago called In From the Margins, which was arguing about the importance of the arts in public policy. I think part of it is this, that our education systems are predicated on a narrow set of purposes which exclude the more profound human and social purposes the arts perform. So on the one hand, we're hampered by a narrow conception of education, and within that, education is predicated on a narrow view of intelligence and ability. So, for example, we've come to think of education, and we haven't, because we're groovy, enlightened people. I'm talking about non-groovy, unenlightened people. But we tend, obviously, who aren't here today, we tend to think education tends to conflate intelligence with a particular form of academic work. So, for example, for years, it was the case in universities that if you want to get involved in the arts, you wrote essays about the arts. You didn't do the arts. So if you want to do art at a university and get a degree in art, you did art history. You didn't sit somewhere and paint. To do that, you went to an art college and got a diploma. If you were interested in literature in a university, you didn't write novels, you wrote about other people's novels. And that always intrigued me. Why was it that writing about novels was thought to be a higher intellectual calling in universities than actually producing the stuff? And I think it's because our education systems are predicated on a particular view of deductive reasoning and critical analysis. It's our Enlightenment conception of education. We have a big schism, we have had for the past 300 years, between the romantic view of human life, which is driven by feeling, allegedly, and the rationalist view of human life, which is driven by critical analysis. And you see this schism played out, and has done for a long time, in the divisions between the arts and sciences in schools and between thinking and feeling. So in the Arts and Schools report, in the Arts and Schools projects I ran, in All Our Futures, and I think in all the work that's represented here, there's evidence of a different way of thinking about human beings and a different way of thinking about the way life operates in individual and social settings. There are 4 big headings. I won't take your time on it, but just let me rehearse them. 4 big reasons, I think, why the arts have to be seen as central. One is that they represent a richer conception of human ability and talent. I published a book a few years ago about talent. It's called The Element, How Finding Your Passion Changes Everything. This book, by the way, is terrific. You would be foolish not to own a copy of this book. But part of what gave rise to it was a recognition that that human resources, if I can use the term, are like the world's natural resources. We make far too much of the differences between ourselves and the rest of life on Earth. And it's a calamitous and myopic conception of our place in the order of things. In 3 ways at least, we are like the world's natural resources. One is that human talent is very, very diverse. It covers an enormous span, from our ability to create mathematical conceptions to our ability to perform complex dances to our abilities to compose sophisticated languages. Human intelligence is richly diverse. It's as diverse as any ecosystem you'll find in any rainforest. Hugely and richly diverse. But our education systems, our social policies have come to focus, for reasons we might talk about, on a particularly narrow conception of human ability. And as soon as you have a narrow conception of ability, you immediately generate an enormous conception of inability or disability. So you invent remedial programs for people who don't fit this narrow conception of ability that we started out with. I always feel that the way we think about intelligence in our education systems would be a bit like reducing all conceptions of sporting ability to one particular sport. You know, it would be like saying that having an entire system of sports education which was focused on finding the people who are really good at lacrosse. I mean, there are people who are good at lacrosse, and I'm not knocking them, and you may be among them. But pick some other sport, but let's say lacrosse. And you'd say, well, these are the people we're really looking for. These are the hot shots. These are the people who really represent the zenith of athletic capability. And the entire system is dedicated to finding these people. And if you don't make the cut, if you're not really good at lacrosse, well, it's okay, because we have remedial programs in football, in cricket, in basketball. And you could find some, second-rate occupation doing that type of thing. But it's the lacrosse people we're really looking for. It's absurd to think that way, but it's what we do in our education system. We look for people who are modeled on a conception of a particular form of academic work, and everybody else, well, we may have some remedial programs for you. Now, the arts to me have always represented a much richer conception. They don't account for all of it, but they represent a much richer conception of ability than that, as you know. So one of the reasons the arts sit at the margins of education is because of this restricted view of intelligence. And it's what we continue to have to campaign against. And the good news is there is a wealth of evidence, research, and plain old human experience that sits behind us in that respect. The second way in which human resources are like the world's natural resources is they're often hidden from view. You have to dig for them. You could spend your entire life and not know what you're capable of doing. Years ago, I helped to set up the Academy for Performing Arts in Hong Kong. They asked me to. I didn't just wander in and impose myself on the process. But one of the people that I worked with there was a guy called Story Wanton, who was from Western Australia. And he was telling me that he was head of the National Film School in Australia. And he grew up on a farm in Western Australia, and the farm went bankrupt. When I say a farm, this is an Australian farm. We'd think of it as a small continent, but it was thousands of acres on which they raised sheep and a few crops. And he said for generations, the family had eked out a pretty poor living from this ground. And then they went bankrupt, and so they left the farm. And apparently in Western Australia, if you walk off the land, it reverts to the provincial government. You don't have any debt, but you don't have any assets either. They just take it over. So they walked away from it and went and lived in Perth. And towards a few, I think probably 20 years later or something, his father was ailing and heading towards the end of his life. And they decided to go take one last look at the old farm. And he said he got his father in the truck, in the trailer, and then they drove out hours to where the old farm was. And they had problems on the highway finding the track that led down to the old farmhouse. He said, and we kept driving up and down, but it wasn't there. And then we realized that where we thought this old track was now another highway. So they went down the highway, and eventually they saw their farmhouse in the distance. But they also saw a lot of trucks around it, and signs, and people, and equipment. And as they drew closer to it, they saw this big sign that said, Western Australian Nickel Company. So they pulled into this reception area, and they got the story. And the story was that after they had moved out, the provincial government of Western Australia had undertaken a geological survey to what they routinely did to see what they'd just inherited. And they found this massive seam of nickel running through the farmland, under the old farmhouse, a few feet below the surface, and it was worth millions and millions of dollars. So they were mining it. So for generations, the Walton family had been sitting on top of this massive seam of nickel, oblivious to its existence, trying to scrape out a meager living from sowing crops just above it. He said, now our ploughshares were skimming the top of it. So he said he looked at his father, thinking he was about to have a coronary, and his father just burst out laughing. And he said they laughed all the way back to Perth. He said the irony of it just convulsed him, that they'd tried all this time to make a living, but they just hadn't dug deep enough. Well, I think the analogy is pretty clear. I think this is true for people. It's what wonderful arts programs reveal, that in our communities, in areas that seem deprived of, bereft of possibility, where people seem not to have the resources they need, often, it's not their conception, it's often the way it's posed. There are deep veins of talent, of passion, of commitment, of outright ability in all kinds of areas that we overlook for want of looking more deeply. And it's true in our school systems, it's true in our communities, in our businesses, that we sit atop massive human resources that we don't fully appreciate. And you don't appreciate them until you find ways of discovering them. And it's one of the reasons we need a broad approach to social policy and a broad approach to education. And the third respect in which human resources are like the world's natural resources is that even when you discover them, you have to do something with them. You have to refine them. There's a big difference between a capacity and an ability. We have all kinds of capacities, but they have to be developed into practical abilities. The good news is people want to do that. There's a very important difference, isn't it, between learning, education, and school. Kids love to learn. They don't all like education, and some of them have a hard time with school. But the process of education is the one through which we try to refine all of these natural abilities. So a major argument for the arts has always been, for me, we need a richer conception of human talent and ability, which is consonant with our conception of the broader riches of the earth that we're part of. A second area is the relationship between knowing and feeling. I'm not going to go into all this in the same detail, but it's a very important thing to recognize that human beings don't live in one world, we live in two. There's a world that exists whether or not you exist. It came into being before you did. Even Artswork came into being before some of you did. So let's face it, there's this outer world, a world that exists whether or not you exist, which was there before you came into it. It's the world beyond your own skin, and education and our social policies have to engage people in understanding that world. But there's a world that exists only because you exist, the world of your own consciousness, your own inner being, that came into being when you did and exists only because you exist. Education has to address both of those. Our social systems, our cultural policies have to address both of these worlds. The natural sciences, if I can caricature it for a moment, the natural sciences are focused on understanding the world around us. The arts sit somewhere in this middle space. The arts are ways in which we come to understand the world around us in relation to our own being in the world. And they represent the junction of knowing and feeling. How we feel is a function of what we know, and what we know affects how we feel. The rationalist view of intelligence tends to divide knowing and feeling, and the arts are ways in which we bring these things back together. And our lives are impelled by feeling as much as they're impelled by our cognitive understanding of the world around us. So there's a whole feeling agenda here. There's an important role for the arts in marrying the self and the community in the wider world around us. And finally, the arts represent what is the signature feature of human intelligence. They don't exclusively represent it, but they do represent the powerful importance of creativity in the world around us. Very few things do set us apart from the rest of life on Earth, but creativity does. Our capacity to bring into mind things that aren't present and to materialize our ideas. Years ago, about 7 years ago actually, I was at a peace summit in Vancouver. It was called the Vancouver Peace Summit. They're very good at titles in Canada. And the guest of honor at the Vancouver Peace Summit was the Dalai Lama. And I hosted the opening session. There were 2,000 people in the room. There were 10 people on the platform, and the guest of honor was His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So the opening session was called World Peace Through Personal Peace. So we had an hour to sort that out. We were just killing time for the final 20 minutes, to be honest. So I had to introduce the Dalai Lama, among other things. Now, you just heard me being introduced, but I had to introduce the Dalai Lama. Well, the Dalai Lama is the head of a wisdom tradition that stretches back over 2,000 years. It predates Christianity. And one of the premises of Buddhism, as represented in that tradition, is that the same Lama is represented continuously in the incarnation of all the Lamas over the past 2,000 years. It's the same spirit. So there's a lot to get into an introduction. That's all I'm saying. If you're able to be comprehensive. And then I thought, I don't really need to introduce him, do I? Because I thought anyone whose name starts with "the," honestly, you can relax, I think, in most social situations. Sorry, which Dalai Lama are you? That would be "the." Anyway, he said lots of wonderful stuff. And one of the things he said, and it's a very, very simple thing to say, but he said, to be born at all is a miracle. So what are you going to do with your life? He wasn't speaking to me, incidentally. I would have taken that personally. But he went generally. We're not here for long when all's said and done. With the following wind, 80, 90 years, life is pretty short in the larger scheme of things. And every human life is different and unrepeatable. Nobody's had your life. Nobody else will have your life. Your children aren't going to have your life. You're not living the life your parents had. No human life is the same as any other human life, internally or externally. And nonetheless, we all have a capacity to shape our lives. It's probably the best evidence we have of the power of creativity, the fact that every human CV is unique and sui generis, that we compose our life. We give in, don't we, to a conception of life being linear, because every now and then you have to write your CV out and you try to give the impression that this whole thing has been a well-organized plan. Because the last thing you want to do is convey to people the actual chaos you've been living through all this time. Because, your life is made up of the choices you make, the decisions you make, the opportunities you move towards, and the ones you move away from. And you end up with your unique, largely fictional CV. But that was his point. What are you going to do with your life? And it's interesting, isn't it? We now live in a period in human history where we are materially better off, even the poorest of us are better off than at any other time in the entire course of the lifespan of humanity. The room you're sitting in, the lives you lead, the clothes you wear, the food you eat, the technologies you have access to, were beyond the dreams of even the most well-to-do people 100, 150 years ago. There is an enormous gap between the very rich and the very poor, but across the spectrum, materially, we have never been better off in the entire course of human history than we are just now, despite the fact we're the largest generation in the entire course of human history, 7.5 billion of us. And yet, one of the biggest epidemics that faces humanity now is depression. Depression, stress, and anxiety. According to the World Health Organization, the second largest cause of morbidity among human beings by 2030 will be depression. The drug companies are thrilled with this. We are stressing ourselves out. Our children are living often in a very toxic environment of social stress. Some of it's being accelerated by the so-called social media, which didn't exist 30 years ago. I always think that social media is an ironic title, since they're not social. If anything, they're antisocial. I don't know, how many friends have you got? When I was at school, I had probably 3 or 4 friends. And I wasn't particularly sad, it wasn't like I was being kept apart from the people with the cattle prod. If you think of it, most people don't have more than 3 or 4 close friends. If you're honest with yourself, and that's about right. People that you would call up, when you're in distress, there's something you really need to talk about, somebody you really need to feel shares your worldview and trusts you enough and you trust them enough to really spill your heart out. People don't have many of those friends. We certainly don't have 500 friends, as Facebook often leads us to believe. And there's a lot of evidence for this, that kids are being put in a very awkward position now because of the pressures of social media. There's this continuous life online, the pressure of school of testing and examinations. I'm at the moment leading, or chairing, I should say properly, a global campaign on behalf of Unilever for the importance of children's play. See, I find this astonishing. We are now in a position of having to persuade people of the importance of children playing. There was a news report, because in America, schools have been cutting back on playtime, or recess, as we call it in America, cutting back because of the pressure of testing in schools, giving kids more time to do homework and test prep. So there's a thing on the TV about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks. Do you care when it was? I'll check it for you. So it was a report from a playground of an elementary school in Houston in Texas. It was definitely Texas. I think it was Houston. And I think, what's going on here? There was this woman reporter with a microphone, like she was embedded in some battle zone, in some far-flung part of the planet. It says, it gave her name, said, here I am, for Eyewitness News, reporting from so-and-so elementary school in Houston, Texas. I'm surrounded here by children playing. Like, ripping this information from the fax machine, this just in. Children seen playing in Texas. And she said, the school is involved in a remarkable experiment. The remarkable experiment was playtime. So these kids are out running around, and virtually they have, reporters pursuing them with microphones saying, tell me, what are you doing right now? This seems to be a rather pointless activity. Can you explain what's going on? You seem to be doing things in your imagination. Can you verify that? Honestly, I'm dead serious. So these kids are being reported on as if it's some kind of frontline activity in some distant war. And then she says, the children now 3 times a day, they get 20 minutes, they run around, and so reporting live from back to the studio. And there's this panel of like four, well, not like four, I count them, actually 4 people, having this sort of strokey beard conversation about it. Like, what do you think about this? What do you make of it? These children seem to be playing. And honestly, and somebody said, and the school has reported, there's been a remarkable increase in the children's energy levels at school, a remarkable increase in how they are attending to classes, and it's claimed there may even be now improvements in test results. I think we've lost our minds, haven't we? We have lost our minds. That we are now trying to find good reasons to allow children to play. We've just done a survey for the campaign is called Dirt is Good. And we did a survey, or rather they did, of 12,000 families around the world. And they asked the parents how much time their children spend outdoors playing. Just playing. I don't mean at the local sports field with their parents standing there holding their kit and screaming abuse at them. I mean playing. Making stuff up, running around, unstructured, unsupervised. Well, it turns out across the world, kids spend much less than an hour a day playing, much less. Often less than 15 minutes, often no time at all. I mean, how much time did you spend as a kid playing outdoors? A lot, I guess. I did. I grew up in Liverpool in the 50s. I'm one of 7 kids, big working class area. We played outdoors all the time. The minute after school finished, we just played outside. The weekend we played outside. We never went home, really, because my parents kept moving house and not telling us where they'd gone. But they loved us. We knew that. But we would go and play, and we'd come home if there was food. That was it. If my mother left food on the step, we'd come back, and we were like cats. And if there was no food, we'd go somewhere else where there was food. It was like that. We just played outside. Well, now kids spend much less than an hour a day outdoors playing. And the thing is this, that the international protocol for maximum security prisoners, for the treatment of maximum security prisoners, is they should be allowed out of their cells, outdoors in the open air, for the minimum of 2 hours a day. So our kids are spending less time outdoors now than maximum security prisoners. And we're having news reports when they're seen playing in the street. Well, tied up with this is a massive increase in anxiety, of stress among young people. The most successful education system on the planet is, in terms of tests, includes South Korea, which also has the highest suicide rate among teenagers anywhere. Kids are suffering from diabetes, obesity. I don't want to paint too bleak a picture here, but I'm saying that we have created a world here where we've lost touch with some of the most natural impulses of what it is to be a human being. And one of the purposes of the arts, among them, is to reconnect us to our basic sense of humanity, to what it is to be a human being alive in the world. It's always been part of that, the development of talent and ability, of the ratio of knowing and feeling, of self and community, and giving people access to their own capacities so they can create a life that means something to them, which has purpose and meaning. And it's what we've heard during these workshops today. I've been online looking at some things that have been going on here. And the workshops have been going into that. I love the quote earlier on from one of the young musicians that the human mind is like a parachute. It's a lovely way to put it. If it's not open, it doesn't work. And part of the role of the art is to open our minds to the world around us and to the world within us. Well, it's always been that way. But we still have to campaign against it for these things. And the need to campaign for these things is even more important than it was 30 years ago. That's my point. This is not a job that's done. This is not a celebratory conference where we say, well, good job, everybody. I think we know we'll go off and do something else now. These issues are becoming more important, not less important, as we go on. And Artswork has created a wonderful base for bringing people together across disciplines and across projects. I've just come back from a conference in Asia. I got back in last night. We were looking at the future of work. We had people there from MIT and from different parts of the region. As we sit here now, things that we may be discussing, or those of you who will be at the 60th anniversary of Artswork, some of the things you may be discussing 30 years from now will be the as yet unknown impact on human life of artificial intelligence. When Artswork started 30 years ago, I say there were no smartphones, there was no digital culture to speak of. One or two people had computers. They were often stored in the garage or on the back of low loaders. People did not go around with computers in their pockets. They did not have personal phone numbers. The smartphone came out 10 years ago, and so far as you can judge, most people think that civilization didn't begin until that happened. But they have totally transformed the way people live, connect, and relate to each other, and how we work. We're on the threshold of the next iteration of the digital revolution with artificial intelligence. It's going to happen. There is no instance I can think of in human history where we've backed away from a transformative technology, no matter what it was, irrespective of what the implications might be. We always give it a go. That was true even of the atom bomb. We thought, well, let's try it. What could possibly go wrong? And so I'm not comparing AI with that, but we are no more able to anticipate the impact of artificial intelligence on our lives than we could the smartphone. We're beginning to realize that it's likely that artificial intelligence will wipe out many manufacturing jobs. It may wipe out many service jobs. It may eradicate all kinds of occupations that we think at the moment only human beings are capable of. It will not lead, I think, to a world of leisure. It will. Years ago, I remember, do you remember Norman St. John Stevens, anybody? Never mind. Norman St. John Stevens was in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet 30 odd years ago, and I had a debate with him, actually on PBS, not long after we'd started Artswork. It was related to the development of Artswork. And I remember he was a member of the cabinet, and he said something like, of course, we can look forward now in the next 30 years to a world in which leisure will become more important than ever. That as employment decreases with the impact of technology, there will be an increase in leisure. How's that working out for you all, by the way, the leisure society? It's nonsense, isn't it? It's like email was going to be the end of the paper industry. It was going to lead to the paperless office. How's that working out? It never goes that way. It never goes that way. And I remember falling out with Norman St. John Stevens, which I was very pleased to have done, because he said that I said, this idea that we're going to live in a world of leisure is patent nonsense. If you have less work, you may have more leisure. If you have no work, you're unemployed. That's a bit different. And it's because of this massive growth of unemployment that we face that the social challenges become massively unpredictable. So there's a lot to talk about what AI will do, but we don't know because we've been very poor in the past at predicting the impact of technology. We do know that 30 years from now, there will be 7.5 billion people on the planet. Saving some massive epidemic, there will be 9 billion people on the planet with more and more strain on the Earth's resources. Cultural tensions are likely to increase rather than reduce in some areas. So the agenda hasn't gone away. The need for powerful arts programs has not depleted, and the need to transform our education system is as urgent, if not more urgent, than it ever was. I think we've got a fantastic base here. There are people all around the world of good faith, good interests, of deep sensibilities who are trying to do what you're doing exactly where you are with the projects they're involved in. I think it's historically important. So I was thrilled to be asked to come along. I want to, just before I'm done, congratulate Artswork, Jane and the whole team for the fantastic work you've been doing. I want to pay tribute to Simon, Rick and Hilary and John Dale and all the other people who laid the foundations for this fantastic organisation. And I want to thank you above all for making me get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to say this.